We live in a time of crisis. It's not a newsflash. Since October 7th, we have seen atrocity piled upon atrocity in the Israeli and Palestinian war. We recently marked the 2-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, which is really an escalation of the Russo-Ukrainian war that actually started in 2014. But beyond Gaza and Ukraine, violent conflicts, climate emergencies, and food shortages in other places around the globe, in Africa, Haiti, Venezuela, to name a few, have led to famine and forced displacements in what has been called an immigration crisis. Many of these crises are too easily forgotten by the news media, neglected by aid donors, often just because their complexity or their relative lack of geopolitical importance. More and more, we witness gun violence in our own country, hoping every time that we hear about one, that the number of victims might not be that large, whatever that means. We are living on an earth in peril because of our own actions. We've observed more drama than decision in Congress, more dysfunction than democracy. And I believe, I've heard, that there's a presidential election going on in the United States, which seems to create more polarizing than politics, more face palms and fanaticism. One way or another, we are living in a time of crisis. What I've noticed, and have you noticed this, is that during this time we can have a cringe response. Before looking at the morning's news or turning on the radio or scrolling through our phones, there may be this subtle hesitation, this inner murmur that if we were to tune in to it, begins with a kind of voice within us, a sub-vocalization. I wonder what craziness is happening now. I wonder what catastrophe could be occurring now. Am I alone in this? For me, it might begin with these sub-vocalizations and then proceed to a kind of a tightening in my shoulders, a gritting of my teeth, and even if I'm paying attention, a momentary holding of my breath. What I'm calling that cringe response. It's a way of freezing in response to the crises that we are in. Often in having conversations with friends, even like last Friday night, friends who were over for dinner, oftentimes there's this question, can you believe this? How could this be happening? And this could represent any number of current crises that are occurring. Yet, my friends, we have a choice in how to respond to this crisis moment that we are in. We have a choice in how to respond to this crisis moment that we are in. Fight, flight, freeze, are only among some of the choices available to us. And our cringe response is a very real response. And the fact that we can name any of these responses, keenly observe ourselves, means that we can lovingly observe our response to what is. For we are more than the physical, the emotional, and the mental dynamics of our cringing in the face of the crises that we are in. Our innate human capacity to observe ourselves, to find a sacred center within from which we can stand alongside and stand within all that is occurring, rather than simply become our cringe response, become our fight, our flight, our freeze responses, may serve us in ways that we don't often readily recognize. Our innate human capacity to cultivate that sacred center, that loving observer within ourselves, is available to us all in the midst of life's storms and even in the throes of crises. Cultivating that inner knowing, that inner attentiveness is so essential to our humanness. It allows us to observe whatever content could absorb, occupy our attention, our consciousness, and surprisingly, it is this pause, this capacity to pause, to observe, to notice, that can often give us more capacity to act consciously and conscientiously and effectively for justice. The ancients called this capacity contemplation. Now, suspend what you think you know about contemplation for just a minute. Let go of some assumptions you might have about monks and monasteries or solitude or escapism or whatever you might call, or what you might even call woo-woo spirituality. When we dispense of some of these costumes that we could put on to contemplation, we may come to recognize, as many neuroscientists today do, that this capacity to pause, to linger, to contemplate may serve us even and especially in these times of crises. Now, if it helps, I offer this definition of contemplation by the contemporary spiritual teacher Cynthia Bourgeault. She writes, "Contemplation understood in the light of a holographic universe is not a special gift. It is simply seeing from the perspective of oneness, or in other words, from the level of spiritual awareness. It can indeed be practiced, and over time, with sincerity and persistence, it becomes an abiding state of consciousness. At times, this unitive seeing may sweep you into rapt adoration, and at other times, it simply deposits you powerfully and nakedly into the present moment." Now, that might sound just a little too esoteric for your taste. So I might translate these words about contemplative practice and the contemplative life into the simple practices of slowing down and lingering with what is. Practices that are so sorely needed in these days. So needed, even when we don't realize how much our hurrying about, our ruminating, our worrying does not actually activate us into deliberate, decisive, and determinative action that can actually make a difference in our lives and in this world. It could be that within crises, there is a message. It could be that crises are nature's way of forcing change, breaking down old structures, shaking loose negative habits so that something new and better can take place. It was Barbara Holmes' short book, Crisis Contemplation, healing the wounded village, that broadened my own understanding of contemplation as a communal practice as well as a personal one. She expanded my understanding that there is such a thing as crisis contemplation that arises from calamity rather than comfort. Holmes offers that when crisis impacts us as a community, we collectively plunge into a space of stillness and unknowing, a shared interiority of potential and spiritual rebirthing. Now, my response to Holmes is that it's not necessarily so. I mean, I do understand the plunge part of her statement, but I would have to say that is how we respond and our capacity to tune in to that shared interiority or spiritual rebirthing that makes it even possible. Our capacity to even tune in makes it possible. But most often, we don't tune in to that. Think of the ways that we typically respond, how we typically move through our days, and we can often observe that we are not available to that shared interiority from which a shift in our capacity to respond can collectively occur. Perhaps you saw the article in the New York Times, "Hurry Up and Wait," by Melissa Kirsch this week. She shares this experience, which I am sure many of us can identify with. She writes, "Racing to catch a subway train recently, I tripped on the stairs leading to the platform, steadying myself only barely by grabbing the arm of an unexpected and rightfully alarmed fellow passenger. I sustained no major damage. A scraped knee, a bruise on my thigh, I discovered a week later. These injuries were, I told myself in the aftermath, well-deserved. I'd disregarded one of my precepts for personal happiness, the one that stipulates most misery is caused by rushing." She continues, "Since my subway incident, I've been trying to notice when I'm rushing, physically and psychologically. Where are you going, I ask myself? And why are you in such a hurry?" That pause helps put a little space between here and there, and might, with any luck, avert future misery. But what I really liked about her article is her naming psychological hurrying as well. She writes, "We rush because we're late. We also rush because we want to move quickly away from discomfort. We rush to come up with solutions to problems that would benefit from more sustained consideration. We rush into obligations or decisions or relationships because we want things settled. Worrying is a kind of rushing. It's uncomfortable to sit in a state of uncertainty. So we fast forward the tape, accelerating our lives past the present moment into some fearsome, imagined scenarios." This pattern of physical and psychological rushing is one that I think impedes our capacity for the kind of personal and collective contemplation that could actually generate more creative and thoughtful responses to the crises that we are in, either personally or collectively. And in the days ahead, my friends, in the days ahead, we are needing to cultivate this capacity for contemplative, slowing down, lingering, being with, rather than trying to move too quickly ahead of what is. Do you hear what I'm saying? And we can help each other with that. Of course, when we're in the midst of crises, contemplation, that seems very counterintuitive. Bayo Akomolafe states that contemplation seems like the wrong thing to do when there's fire on the mountain, but in hurrying up all the time, we often lose sight of the abundance of resources that might actually help us meet today's most challenging crises. The call to slow down works to bring us face to face with the invisible, the hidden, the unremarked, and the yet to be resolved. Barbara Holmes also underlines this in her exploration of what she calls crisis contemplation when she says, to slow down and be still is to allow both the source of our troubles and the options for recovery to emerge. Both to emerge. It may be hard to imagine, as Holmes postulates, that contemplation is an act of abiding with and enabling the possibility of justice. It was hard for me to really understand her point until I had a recent experience that I think illustrated it for me. Last Sunday afternoon, I attended a peace walk focusing on the crisis in Israel and Palestine. It was sponsored by the American Friends of Combatants for Peace, and I've spoken about this group before. Combatants for Peace is a grassroots movement of Israelis and Palestinians working together to end the occupation and bring peace, equality, and freedom to their homeland. It was founded by former fighters on both sides, quote unquote, of the conflict in 2006. I've attended a number of their events during this crisis period since October. The Peace Walk included over 250 people of different ages, backgrounds, ethnicities, and religions, Muslims and Jews, Christians, Quakers, and many others. We began the march with a few opening words and some nigun, those are Hebrew wordless prayers that have chant-like tones. We were asked not to carry any signs that we might have brought. Instead, there were signs with the faces of children, Israeli and Palestinian children who had died during the many weeks of this current conflict in Gaza and Israel. The peace walk was silent, no chanting. We were encouraged to imagine every step was like a prayer. We walked up one side of a busy section of a Philadelphia street, Germantown Avenue, that had been closed down for our walk. And first, as we walked up the hill, and I could sense the solemnness of this act, every step being like a prayer, it was like a contemplative time, a time of feeling the unity of our common concern with those who had joined together for this walk, maybe 4 across or 5 across as we walked up one side of the avenue. And also a kind of a common concern, obviously, for the situation that we were witnessing to. We were not talking or advocating or for one side of the conflict or another, just for the one side of peace. It was when those in front of the line took a U-turn and proceeded on the same street on the opposite lane so I could see the procession of faces who had previously been in front of me. It was at that moment that I could see the posters of the faces of the Israeli and the Palestinian children and their names, those who had died during these recent weeks of conflict. I couldn't help but be moved to tears. Since through the steps of that silent march, I was in a state of actually abiding with others. Those gathered with me whose steps signaled our commitment to a peace that was beyond our current understanding, that I was then also to abide then with these children who had been unwilling, innocent, tragic victims of senseless terrorism and relentless retaliation. To linger in those feelings was not a comfortable one. To abide with those actual faces and names was not a comfortable one. But it was indeed, for me, a crisis contemplation. Contemplation taking place in the midst of a crisis. It was in my tears for the children that I connected most with why there must be a path to peace, why there must be a stopping, at the very least, a humanitarian pause to this conflict. Justice is needed for no other sake in my mind and heart than for these Israeli and Palestinian children. It's quite a different experience to just see numbers than it is to see faces of real children killed, whose lives were cut off so tragically by a senseless, mean conflict. So for some of us, contemplation may take many forms. It might be really a forum in which we gather with others to walk for the sake of peace and to declare the need for justice. For others of us, it may be gathering with others just to hold in silence whatever is occurring in our own lives or in the world that we share. For some, it might be gardening. Who finds contemplation in gardening? Let me just see a few hands. Yeah. For some of us, it might be a walk in nature. And for some of us, it might just be a silent pause at the dawning of a new day or at the end of a day, where we just abide with the precious moments of life that we have had that day. A colleague reminded me this week of this quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweet Grass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. It spoke to me of that even in the midst of so much conflict, there still are sources of renewal and regeneration within us, among us, and around us in the very earth itself. The quote is, "Grieving is a sign of spiritual health, but it is not enough to weep for our lost landscapes. We have to put our hands in the earth to make ourselves whole again. Even a wounded world is feeding us. Even a wounded world holds us and gives us moments of wonder and joy. I choose joy over despair," she writes, "not because I have my head in the sand, but because joy is what the earth gives me daily, and I must return that gift. So, my friends, in the midst of all that is happening in the world, in our own individual worlds and the greater world that we share, may we still find sources of joy that renew us and strengthen our resolve to bring more life, more peace, and more compassion by our own presence in this world. So the practice of contemplation, even in the midst of crisis, may allow us to slow down and to linger, to abide with one another in a situation so that we may find a shared interiority of potential and spiritual rebirthing. Akomolafe teaches, slowing down is about lingering in the places we are not used to, seeking new questions, becoming accountable to more than what rests on the surface. So as we move forward through the weeks and the months ahead, I want to encourage us to slow down. I'll try to model that. I want to encourage us to linger, to not hurry ahead, to not merely cringe at the challenges in the world that we share, but to find ways to hold space within ourselves and to hold space for one another as we dare to be with what is happening in our own lives and in the community, in the country, and in the world around us. And in so doing, may we find a new grounding to accompany our work for justice, to strengthen our work of compassion and care, and for deepening our personal and collective spiritual lives. So may it be.